Imagine this: a room filled with businesses and policymakers. They agree on two things. Circular economy is critical for tackling the climate crisis, but it is not showing up in their accounting of their greenhouse gas emissions. My guest on the Circular Economy show today, João from the MacArthur Foundation, was in that room. Listen to this episode to find out what he and the foundation did, what they found out, and what businesses can do now to change that picture. Thanks for joining us on the Circle Me show, João. Many of our listeners will have heard us talk about the topic of climate change and circular economy before, but I wondered actually if we could start by just recapping for the small percentage that perhaps haven't tuned into this topic. What is the connection between circular economy and climate? What role does circular economy play in tackling the climate crisis?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Seb. It's a pleasure to be here. And, well, in its essence, we cannot hit the Paris Agreement without the circular economy. Half of the emissions that we need to address will come from changing the ways we extract, use, and dispose of resources. The other half being energy. But on a deeper level, the energy problem is also a linear economy, circular economy issue. The way we're extracting coal and oil and burning for energy is also deeply rooted into a linear system. So on a statistical level, yes, half of the emissions come from about energy, and the other half will come from addressing material use and resources. But our system is deeply rooted in the linear economy, and without transitioning and changing how we make use of our resources, we will not be able to hit the Paris Agreement.
Yes, and to double down on that point, I guess when people think of a car, for instance, they think about the exhaust fumes, the energy that's being burned by using that car, but they often don't think about all of the materials and energy and what's involved in the production of that vehicle and the making of the metals and various things that go into making a car. Obviously, you're a first-time guest on the podcast, João, but I was actually watching you about a month ago on stage speaking to an audience at an MacArthur Foundation event, and you told this fantastic story where you described talking about this topic of addressing emissions through circular economy to a policy and business audience. I wonder if you could just tell us that story again. Like, what were you talking about, and what happened in that room that day?
Yeah, exactly. It was a very powerful moment. We've been highlighting how crucial circular economy is for addressing climate change. Since 2019, we've published a report and have made the point very strongly that about half of the emissions are related to how we use and manufacture and dispose of products. Other institutions have arrived at the same number. The International Resource Panel, for example, consistently arrive at a very similar data. So organizations, companies, our members, they understand that. But in that room that day, we've had a great combination of businesses and policymakers in the room. And there was a sound agreement between them that they understand that circular economy is important, but they cannot see that on their own accounting. They are attempting to implement circular economy strategies, pushing the idea forward, but they cannot see the benefit in when they report their emissions. And that was a major issue.
And I think the really important point there is, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about before, is, of course, the moment you sign up to something like the Paris Agreement or your business and you set, your targets, say this is how we're going to help tackle the climate crisis, climate change, you then have to start tracking like something that maybe a lot of organizations and countries haven't done for that long, and depending again on and how long they've been invested in the issue. But you then have to better say, these are our emissions today that we can track to our activities at various levels without getting too technical about it, and this is our target, and this is our year on year, or however frequent the reporting is, and if you can't show how something like circular economy shows up in that, then it's hard to say, even if the macro data from something like our publications or the ROP publications says there's a really clear link here between this activity and emissions reductions, it's quite hard to justify it as part of that strategy. So then what did we
Absolutely.
do? What did we actually do to try and help them address that problem?
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to justify being part of the strategies. It's hard to justify being part of companies' targets if they just simply cannot see that on their accounting. That's, yeah, exactly that. And so after being informed of this issue by a great number of businesses and policymakers, we've decided to dive deep into what the problem, what was going on. Why was that the case? If we know the circular economy can address a significant percentage of global emissions, why organizations were not seeing that on their accounting and policymakers were complaining about the same issue? And essentially, we started to investigate the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the world's most widely used framework for accounting and measuring greenhouse gas emissions for organizations. Any company anywhere in the world will be familiar with the GHG protocol and how it divides emissions into scope 1, 2, and 3. And when we began this process, we uncovered, together with companies in our network from a broad range of industries, several areas of conflict where circular economy would then not be well represented or would be penalized for the accounting. Well, the GG protocol is a fantastic initiative, but it was set up in the 90s, and it was set up under a linear economy blueprint with the linear economy rules. And in order to assign emissions responsibility for companies and so on, it penalizes strategies that can actually reduce emissions. And we uncover five main areas of that need urgent addressing, and that would significantly improve how companies see the potential of circular economy in hitting their net zero targets.
And we can probably come on to those five areas in a moment, Joe. And even just that, I think it's quite a profound point you just made, actually, that, something set up in the 90s, it was very hard to foresee the sorts of innovations that are going to be needed to tackle the climate crisis, obviously, which is a very different issue even in the 90s compared to now in terms of the projections, in terms of the science, in terms of how far, obviously, the economy has changed and how rapidly the issue has increased in terms of prevalence and challenge. But I wonder if we could just dive into a cut when you said actually what you found was that actually there was companies could be penalised actually for circular economy models, or circular innovations could be penalised. What does that mean? What sort of innovations or what sort of circular economy things might be almost penalised by the way the GHG protocol was set up?
Great question. And there's a few. One of the most prominent ones that our other organizations are also aware is in terms of durability. It is very hard to implement systems of reuse and repair and remanufacturing, a circular economy that thrives with products and materials that simply do not last. So durability is a key component. And how the current protocol and the guidance is set up at the moment, companies are essentially penalized for increasing the durability of their products and their materials. That is because in the year of sale, companies have to report not the emissions that have occurred in the production process, but they also have not only those, but they also have to forecast the emissions that will occur in the lifetime of the product. Those are essentially our future emissions, which creates a problem in comparing short-lived goods with durable products, because a cell phone, for example, that lasts 5 years will report very little emissions compared to a cell phone that would last 20 years, because it has emissions when you charge the phone, right, during its uh, usable life. But what we were proposing is, of course, these emissions occur and they have to be captured, but it's important to address how they are captured. So potentially reporting these emissions year on year, so that they align with each year of reporting, rather than all of them being lumped together in one year, would make the comparison more fair. Otherwise, any company developing any product that is durable would basically look worse than short-lived goods, just because of a decision on where to allocate those emissions.
And that's where this in some ways is an accounting challenge you're describing, right, as well, which is to say that what that doesn't account for currently is that potentially a product lasting 20 years instead of 5 years may negate the need to produce more products, which would also show up on a year accounting basis.
Exactly. Yes, it that's a very good point. A product that lasts longer would essentially remove the need to continue manufacturing a product to substitute the obsolescence of the short-lived good. And this benefit becomes shadowed by the need of companies to report all these future emissions ahead of time, which makes the comparison between these two types of product unfair and inaccurate.
Another
Mm.
example that I've heard mentioned is around kind of new business models. There's a lot, obviously, in the fashion industry around rental, for instance, or resale, or whatever it might be. But many circular economy innovations relate to, can we somehow provide a product as a service or in some other form of business model other than just selling it outright? And I understand that also has some disadvantage in the way that things are accounted for in the current GHG protocol.
Absolutely. Um, it's important to emphasize that the the GHG protocol is trying to capture all the emissions that a company has in its processes. But in order to do that, it has to take some decisions on where and when to allocate these emissions, and that's where the conflicts are arising. So, in terms of the rental model you were just mentioning, companies when they set up rental, what they're doing is that they're changing the ownership structure of the product. Products, instead of in the protocol being considered that you sold the product to a customer, you still retain that ownership. And that means that you are reporting your emissions of product use. For example, a car. A company's renting a car, the emissions of using or driving would now be responsibility of the company's scope one, instead of their scope three, which is customers using the car. The issue with that is that when financial institutions are going to look at the climate benefit of companies, financial institutions are not required at the moment to report the scope 3 emissions of who they're investing in. So essentially, by companies implementing rental model and moving these emissions from scope 3 to scope 1, they're going to look more carbon intensive on the eyes of investors than if they were operating on a linear model. This is obviously not true, but it's just around a decision of how that the allocation changes to the scope one, and that investors only have visibility of company scope one and scope two, creating the false impression that by implementing rental models, suddenly companies have a major increase in their emissions.
And what's the answer to that one, João?
Yeah, but first, it would be great if financial institutions also reported scope three emissions of who they invest in. But in order for that to be fair and useful for financial institutions, that means all companies have to be required when following GHG protocol. They should be required to report their scope three so that financial institutions have easy access to that data. That is because right now what we have is that scope three is optional for reporting. It's only in order to follow the guidelines of the GHG protocol. Only scope one and two are mandatory. So making scope three mandatory and requiring financial institutions to report that on who they invest in would fix that problem.
And that also really highlights what you were saying earlier of why the root cause of many of these challenges is the linear economy. And when we design these really good initiatives, if they're still designed like kind of with the linear economy in mind, it can be really difficult. So the current linear economy kind of like assumes infinite resources, no extraction things. So it kind of imagines a business as basically from the moment something goes into the factory to the moment someone buys it. And of course, what we know is that the economy doesn't operate that way. Something does happen to that product after it's bought. There are a load of impacts and things to consider before it reaches that factory door. But that system perspective then has to be somehow incorporated into everything we understand about the economy to give us a clear picture.
Absolutely. And another clear example is in terms of end of life. When companies they have to report the emissions of the end of life of the product. And currently, the guidance allows for incineration with waste to energy, with energy recovery, to report zero emissions. They allow that to happen even if the companies do not purchase this energy afterwards, even if this incineration happens elsewhere. That is a major problem because now you're asking businesses that want to compete, that want to implement recycling, repairing, reusing, to compete with linear practices such as incineration reporting zero emissions, which is also highly inaccurate because a lot of emissions have taken place in the process of incineration, and they should be appropriately uh, allocated as well.
And what you're saying there is it just needs to be like for like, right? In terms
Yes,
of,
yes,
like
exactly.
if those two things get accounted for. Those are really helpful illustrative examples, João. Thank you. And they really bring it to life in terms of that, what is actually obviously quite technical, technical work in terms of how emissions are allocated, how they're measured, how they're tracked, but really understanding them through those examples is really powerful. I guess, Mike, as we kind of come to the end of our conversation, I'm kind of interested, like, what now? What next? What can businesses do in this space if the challenges you're reflecting on in this conversation are familiar to them? They're like, yeah, we don't see our emissions, and we feel like we're being punished for making more durable products or trying to extend end of life, whatever it might be. What are the pathways for them? How can they engage? What can they do?
Fantastic, fantastic question. Um, Essentially, out of this project, we established a good relationship with the GG protocol, and we're now sitting at the technical working group for promoting changes to the Scope 3 guidelines, particularly. So the all the changes that were proposed in our paper together with the businesses that helped us develop this paper are going to be fed into this process. And companies are absolutely encouraged to also reach out to us in particularly because this is a long process. The GG protocol revision will take a couple of years. If they're experiencing these issues and there's more things that maybe even we missed on our paper because different industries experience different problems, they can feed that to us, and we'll definitely bring that into conversation into the GG protocol to actually change how emissions are accounted for companies. And another area they can, of course, um, have direct influence is they can, of course, look at our paper and the GG protocol once a decision has been taken on what to change, they make that public, and companies can voice their opinion and they can feed into that revision process, and they can use our insights to help push momentum for the need to change the way they've been accounting emissions and make sure the circular economy is fairly and accurately captured in that process.
And in terms of that engagement with the GHG protocol, João, I think you mentioned there were kind of like 5 challenges, 5 recommendation areas. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of what are the types of themes, what are the areas that you're kind of working on or advising on, shall we say, through the technical working group?
Absolutely. Well, essentially, first, there's an overall lack of clarity and consistency in how circular economy activities are treated in emissions reporting. So, a first area is to make sure that the new revisions of the GG protocol do embed a very clear approach to how to report circular economy emissions, because not all issues are direct penalizations, but some are just simply companies not sure how to report suddenly when there are multiple uses of a product and multiple users. It complicates the reporting, and creating that clarity is vital. We're making proposals to improve how circular material inflows and procurement are reported, product use and durability, circular material outflows and end of life, and as well as financed emissions. Those are our main areas of influence.
Great. Thank you, João. And then final question. It's a bit of a leading question because of the incredible inside knowledge I hold. But is this just a problem for businesses? Like, is this emissions accounting thing kind of restricted to businesses?
No, no, it's not. And that is a fantastic question. We witness a very similar problem. Policymakers have been feeding to us, and we we know countries experience a very similar issue where circular economy simply isn't visible, particularly because the system is based on a production-based system. They don't have to report emissions of consumption, which means that if countries currently substitute some of their consumption through repairing, remanufacturing, repurposing, their emissions might even go up simply because they never had to account for the emissions of their consumption. And that is a problem that is definitely worth investigating, and we're looking into it.
It sounds like it's your next challenge, João. Thanks so much for joining us on the Circle Me Show. It's really great having you, and we'll speak to you again, I'm sure, in the future as these projects develop. So the message is simple. The circular economy is a critical part of tackling the climate crisis, and therefore it needs to show up as a positive on the accounts of businesses and governments all over the world. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Circular Economy Show. We'll put a link to the paper that João mentioned in our show notes. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with your colleagues. And we'll see you next time.